to thank your presence here today. En primer lugar, quiero, por supuesto, agradecer a todos los participantes y las participantes, expertos, su presencia en este evento importante para nosotros, importante para el grupo de socialdemócratas. Y soy consciente de que algunos de ustedes han viajado desde muy lejos para unirse a nosotros y estamos muy agradecidos por vuestra presencia. Y también quiero extender mis agradecimientos a todas las personas que de manera remota están conectados y conectadas ahora mismo a este evento. Y agradecer porque al final esto es una clara demostración de la preocupación y el compromiso que existe hacia esta cuestión tan importante. El esfuerzo, compromiso y el gran trabajo realizado por nuestras compañeras y compañeros del Grupo Socialdemócrata son la base de las propuestas concretas que tendremos hoy encima de la mesa para poder intercambiar, para poder debatir y para poder escuchar, ¿no? Porque al final esto también se tiene que basar en la escucha activa y el poder aprender los unos de los otros. Y este es un día importante para que todas y todos podamos aprender de las distintas perspectivas y visiones. Me siento orgullosa de poder decir que nuestro grupo lleva muchos años liderando los esfuerzos en esta Cámara por un comercio más justo y más sostenible. Hemos expresado y hemos sido muy activos en pedir y reiterar nuestros continuos llamamientos a reformar los acuerdos de libre comercio de la Unión Europea, así como mejorar y fortalecer las cláusulas en aras de que los derechos humanos, la agenda social y las preocupaciones medioambientales en el comercio estén plenamente garantizadas e incorporadas en ello. Estos tres elementos son fundamentales para nosotros en todo lo que tiene que ver con el trabajo que desarrollamos en la Comisión de Comercio Internacional, pero evidentemente, y todos ustedes son muy conscientes de ello, que va más allá de la propia cuestión del comercio internacional, sino que tiene mucho que ver también con la incorporación de estas prioridades que tienen que ver con la agenda social y que tienen que ver con la agenda medioambiental. Gracias a nuestro esfuerzo, llamamientos y demandas, podemos afirmar que se han y se están asumiendo nuevos compromisos a lo largo de este periodo legislativo para que las cadenas de suministro globales y las relaciones comerciales sean más justas y más sostenibles. Puedo mencionar, por ejemplo, la propuesta de la Comisión Europea sobre la diligencia debida de las empresas en materia de sostenibilidad, la Directiva sobre informes de sostenibilidad corporativa, el Reglamento de forestación y la degradación forestal, el nuevo enfoque para los capítulos de comercio, sostenibilidad y desarrollo, por citar solamente algunos de los ejemplos de estas cuestiones a las que me refiero y en la que muchos de nuestros compañeros y compañeras del grupo están y estamos trabajando. Pero lo que es vital y fundamental subrayar hoy es la propuesta de reglamento para prohibir los productos elaborados con trabajo forzado, que es finalmente una realidad y forma parte de esta lista a la que me he referido. Lo quiero subrayar y destacar, fundamentalmente porque la prohibición de los productos elaborados con trabajo forzado es y seguirá siendo una prioridad política para nuestro grupo. Está en nuestros genes y lleva nuestra firma. Prohibir la entrada en el mercado de la Unión Europea de productos fabricados con trabajo forzado ha sido una de nuestras demandas clave en todo este tiempo. Prohibir los productos fabricados con trabajo forzado en el mercado de la Unión es mucho más que una simple cuestión política. Es ante todo un imperativo moral y un deber cívico. Y yo estoy segura que esta cuestión, además, es en las cuestiones en las que la ciudadanía europea se puede sentir cerca y se puede sentir reflejado en lo que es el proyecto europeo, porque no tengo ninguna duda de que si a cualquier ciudadana o ciudadano de la Unión Europea le preguntáramos qué le parece que en Europa se prohíban los productos que han sido producidos por trabajo forzado, no tengo ninguna duda, de verdad, de que estarían totalmente a favor de esta propuesta. Y eso es lo que necesitamos también muchas veces hacer, legislar sobre la base de aquellas cuestiones en las que hay sensibilidad social y demostrar, por lo tanto, que Europa es mucho más que un proyecto de cooperación económica entre nosotros y que es un conjunto también de valores que nos unen y que si pretendemos ser ejemplo en el resto del mundo para cualquier otras cuestiones, no es entendible que en la Europa, que en el mundo del siglo XXI se esté intercambiando y se esté produciendo mercado con productos de este tipo. Por lo tanto, como digo, no es solo una cuestión política, es una cuestión cívica y moral. Estamos de acuerdo en que la diligencia debida cambia las reglas del juego, sí, pero no sería suficiente por sí sola. En situaciones de abusos o violaciones graves de los derechos humanos, como es el caso del trabajo forzado, las prohibiciones en el mercado y las restricciones comerciales pueden ser una herramienta complementaria extremadamente eficaz. Nos ayudan a decir basta cuando sea necesario. Ahora ha llegado el momento de evaluar la propuesta de la Comisión Europea en detalle, junto con las partes y actores interesados y relevantes, así como con los más afectados, para garantizar que el texto final incluya nuestras ambiciones y demandas y prioridades, todas ellas bien reflejadas en la última resolución adoptada por este Parlamento en junio de este mismo año. Y por eso es extremadamente importante estar hoy aquí, elaborando nuestra estrategia a seguir en el camino por construir. El trabajo forzado, por desgracia, todavía hoy es y sigue siendo parte de nuestra realidad. Según las estimaciones mundiales de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, no menos de 28 millones de personas estaban en situación de trabajo forzado en el 2021. 3 millones más que hace 5 años. No solo no hemos conseguido reducir esta cifra, es que, por el contrario, la cifra va en aumento. Es nuestra responsabilidad política y nuestra obligación moral como socialdemócratas y europeos vencer esta lucha y erradicar prácticas tan inaceptables y atroces. Tenemos una oportunidad histórica de cumplir con nuestro compromiso en línea con nuestros valores y principios después de años de movilización cívica y batallas políticas difíciles. Espero que el evento de hoy sirva para poder cumplir con este objetivo y ofrecer a todas las partes interesadas una plataforma suficiente y sólida para comenzar e impulsar este trabajo tan importante, aprovechando las lecciones aprendidas sobre el terreno y elaborar un marco legislativo europeo tan necesario como esto. Y ahora la responsabilidad está en este Parlamento, la responsabilidad está en los diputados y diputadas que tenemos que trabajar sobre esta propuesta, pero evidentemente no podemos hacerlo solos y solas. Necesitamos a todos aquellos, a todas aquellas, a todos los que estáis trabajando también desde vuestras distintas responsabilidades en cuestiones que afectan a esta legislación. Estoy segura de que al final de este camino dejaremos el trabajo forzado, finalmente, de una vez por todas, relegado a donde pertenece, a un pasado muy lejano. Y ahora tengo el placer de darle la palabra a mi compañero Berlange, presidente de la Comisión de Comercio Internacional de esta Cámara. Bernd, por favor.
Thanks a lot, Irache, and welcome also from my side. It's really amazing to see you sitting around. Also, a lot of young people engaged in the fight against forced labor. And as Irache mentioned, more than 28 million people worldwide, sometimes also inside the European Union, are suffering under forced labor conditions. More than 28 million people worldwide. In a frame where the International Labour Organization adopted in 1930 the clear condemn of forced labor, the famous ILO Convention 29. And then again, some additional obligations for the member states of the ILO in 1957, the ILO Convention 105. But regardless, this really important ILO convention, even in this time and this age, forced labor is a practice, and as Irache said, it's on the rise. Now the ILO mentioned more than 3 million people more than 4 years ago. So it's really urgent to act. We see the example in Xinjiang, but also in Malaysia and in other countries. It's really important that we act as Europeans based on our values. Trade has to be based on our values. It's not just an end in itself. It has to benefit the people on the ground. It has to benefit to stop forced labor. The S&D, myself, and also the International Trade Committee requested a piece of legislation for a long time. In 2010, we started with the hard work to ask for such a legislation. 12 years ago. And I remember here in this room, I discussed 8 years ago with the former Commissioner of Trade, Cecilia Malmström, exactly about such a legislation. So the S&D pushed very hard for a legislation banning products of forced labor. Now we have a proposal on the table, and I'm quite happy with this proposal because it is covering not only the import of forced labor product, but also the marketing of forced labor product inside the European Union. This means that we have also to investigate, for example, the meat industry in Germany and the conditions of the people working there, and also the export of products based on forced labor. So it's really a comprehensive approach, and we will work on that. And I'm quite sure that we will have a lot of discussion today in the good examples we have seen, but also the requirements for the people on the ground. This instrument is as such not new. We know that the United States have an instrument also since 1930 with some modification. Canada has this one. But I guess we can really learn the lesson from the experience of these countries to have a really comprehensive and much advanced legislation here in the European Union. We want to really address the root of causes of forced labor in all dimensions and combining different instruments and tools at our disposal. So we have also Lara Wolters here with the rapporteur for the due diligence legislation, which is really close linked to this, but also the legislation of deforestation. So we have a lot of new tools which fit together. So I'm really happy that we can have this conference today tackling some success stories where forced labor was being tackled successfully, and also in our practice regarding the industry in Uzbekistan, where forced child labor was banned because of our activities, is one of these possibilities to go ahead. But this is not the end of the story. Perhaps it's just the beginning. Now we have the possibilities to create a tool which is much stronger and more efficient, and I'm looking forward to the debate of today, and let's work together so that we have quite soon this necessary tool in our hands so that people worldwide can really work under free conditions. Thanks a lot.
Okay, then I'm going to take over and I'm going to invite the guests for our first panel. The first panel is an interesting panel. Second panel also interesting, sorry. But the first panel is interesting, it's interesting because you can say it's our fact-finding mission. We are going to listen to reports from experts, academics, people from NGOs already involved in addressing the issue of forced labor. Can I invite to the podium? Let's see if everything is going to be okay. I think I do have to do some logistics. But can I have on the podium Adrian Zenz, Ruslan Miatev. Yeah, is that okay? Adrian, you're going to sit over here. I'm going to move over. Thank you. Ruslan Matthew, Raluca Dumitrescu, Andy Hall, and Rosie Hurst. Everyone have a place and a name tag? Yeah? Okay. That's okay then. Then move over. We move over, okay. A little bit of gymnastics is always interesting. Huh? So to our guests, I'm going to introduce them one by one and ask them some questions. But like I said, this is our fact-finding mission. And then in the second panel, we're going to address the issue, the question, in how far does the new legislation proposal be helpful to address the problems you have been able to introduce to this panel. So also from my side, a warm welcome. I have distinguished guests. And I start with you, Adrian Zenz. Senior Fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, a think tank established in the US by the US government based in Washington, D.C. From education, you're an anthropologist.
Yes.
Yes? Sorry, it's a very difficult word if you come from the Netherlands, sorry.
Just say I do research.
You do research, and you did your research in the intern camps and the Uyghur genocides. And I think you can say that your research formed the base of legislation because it was solid proof of what was happening in China. So I think we can say, Adrian, we know through the media a little bit about your findings, but of course through the media is always secondhand. So now we have the opportunity to hear from you firsthand about your findings. And I think, Adrian, for you, the floor, 50 minutes. Bring us up to speed about what you have found out.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for having me here. I have 15 minutes, and I have a lot to say, so I'll get going right away. I am looking at Xinjiang, the region where the Uyghurs are being oppressed, and I'm focusing on the concept of state-sponsored forced labor and how that is different from other forms of forced labor. Next slide, please. So, as we have heard, the ILO Forced Labor Convention began to define and tackle forced labor in 1930, and it did include some compromises because there were colonial powers at the time who still needed forms of state-sponsored forced labor in their colonies. And it was not until 1950s, next slide please, that the next labor convention, 105, specifically now banned forced labor imposed by states for the purpose of furthering political goals, including for economic development or as a means of racial or religious discrimination. It was tackling state-sponsored forced labor associated with so-called development dictatorships. Forced labor was justified with promises of development, progress, and poverty alleviation. And of course, there were all kinds of examples of forced labor at the time, notably, of course, the Soviet gulags, the Nazi wartime labors, and ongoing situations in colonial realms. Next slide, please. So the particular challenge or the interesting fact about state-sponsored forced labor, which is what we have among the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in northwestern China, is that the coercion and state-sponsored forced labor is based on an overall coercive environment. And this overall coercive environment is created and nurtured by the comprehensive efforts of a resourceful, centralized authoritarian state. It's a whole of government and whole of society approach. And it's perhaps not surprising that you find this in governments that have very strong bureaucratic apparatuses, such as communist or socialist, or in some cases post-socialist states, with the so-called Leninist state bureaucracy, with strong grassroots mobilization capabilities. Next slide, please. Academics who have looked at forced labor in Uzbekistan, which we have heard Uzbekistan was the other case of state-sponsored forced labor. It actually ended state-sponsored forced labor, have argued that there is an environment of structurally forced consent, where there's no longer the freedom to actively decide for or against taking part in the cotton industry. And that applies to the entire country, region, affected, targeted groups. It's not just one company, it's not just one sector. It's an atmosphere, it's an environment. And that's very much what we're looking at here in Xinjiang. And of course, Mr. Bernd Lange mentioned Xinjiang particularly as a region of particular urgency, where there's an ongoing risk of genocide, there's mass internment, and forced labor is one aspect of that system. And I'm getting to the details, but I'm still panning out the conceptual picture here. Because if we look at the proposed legislation that the European Union is proposing at the moment to tackle forced labor, much of that, just like the ILO, much of that is targeting private company forced labor, because that's over 80% of forced labor in the world. But in the particular case of Xinjiang, we need a different approach because it's a different type. Next slide, please. So the common forms of forced labor targeted by the ILO or by nation states is you have coercive practices associated typically with workplaces. Maybe they're endemic in an industry, but they're still based on private workplaces or the financial profit that comes with it. And the motives are profit-driven. So the ILO has a set of 11 indicators of forced labor, and you probably are familiar with them. They basically mostly relate to what happens to workers at their workplace and how they're being exploited materially. Next slide, please. Now, one can, and we have tried to apply them to the situation among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But the problem is they're not actually designed for that. Some of them fit, some of them don't. In Uzbekistan, you could match more of them because state-sponsored forced labor in Uzbekistan was primarily motivated by economic considerations. In Xinjiang, the primary motivation of the government of Beijing with the Uyghurs is not merely economic, although that is a component, it is political. It's for reasons of stability, maintenance, and social control and assimilation. So they're not specifically designed to identify state-sponsored forced labor. State-sponsored forced labor is systemic and endemic in society. It creates an environment of coercion, and that's what you have to measure. It's embedded in the social context. It's often not easily identified in workplaces. The ILO indicators also are static. State-sponsored forced labor is actually a dynamic process, as we see in the next slide. It's a systemically coercive environment created and maintained through enormous grassroots resources, which is often why you find this in regimes that have these grassroots mobilizational capability. You had it under Mao Zedong's China. Now again, Xi Jinping has greatly increased it again. You have it, it's typically of communist or maybe not, China is of course economically more complicated, but communist, post-communist sort of socialist market regimes that have retained that apparatus. Typically, state-sponsored forced labor is most easily identified at the early phases, the recruitment phase, the training and placement stage, not so much at the workplace itself. Next slide, please. So for most forms of forced labor, you identify select companies or supply chains. For state-sponsored forced labor, you have to identify the presence of systemic environment of coercion for an entire industry or region. In Uzbekistan, it was an industry in the whole country. In Xinjiang, it's not just cotton. It's not helpful to try to just identify specific companies or factories, although we have done that to give examples, and there are specific witness accounts. But that's not sufficient, and it's not a sufficient way of tackling the problem. Next slide, please. I apologize for truly rushing you through a very complicated forced labor situation in Xinjiang. And this is actually often misunderstood. And I have to say, there are plenty of writings on Xinjiang forced labor that are not accurate, to put it just very, very bluntly. There are two systems of forced labor. They are conceptually distinct. Only one system directly relates to the internment camps. Camp detainees are placed into a range of low-skilled, labor-intensive manufacturing sectors. Examples include toys, furniture, garments, textiles, electronics, etc. There's very little documentation on that, very, very little policy documentation. The second system pertains to agriculturalists who have not been in a camp, who are coercively recruited, trained, and transferred to work outside of agriculture. Labor transfer is a sectoral transfer out of agriculture or out of farm labor that may or may not involve a physical transfer. And that one is bigger. It involves a wide range of low-skilled, labor-intensive manufacturing. We have polysilicon. We have agricultural harvesting as cotton, tomatoes, fruit, peppers. Oftentimes, there's a sectoral approach to understanding forced labor in Xinjiang. So we say, oh, there's cotton, oh, there's polysilicon, because we have high-profile reports like this one or another one on a particular sector. But the systemic understanding of forced labor in Xinjiang requires us to understand that really it affects potentially any type of lower-skilled, labor-intensive work. Next slide, please. This is my estimate of the scale. Obviously, it's an estimate. It's a conservative estimate. Of course, we know that possibly 1 to 2 million Uyghurs at some point were put in a camp or may now have been shifted to prisons to some extent. So up to 500,000 in forced labor is a conservative estimate. I don't have time to get into details. This is particularly linked to the vocational skills education and training centers. Poverty elevation through labor transfer, the second scheme, is much bigger. It's been intensified, and labor transfer in Xinjiang encompasses about 3 million. But not all of them can be considered to be in forced labor, because some people want to earn more money, some people want to get out of agriculture, right? So the estimate of those at risk of forced labor is 1.5 to 2 million, roughly. That's really an estimate, getting us to a total scale of 2 to 2.5 million, which is nearly 10% of the global 28 million, although I don't think that the 28 million figure did this kind of calculation on Xinjiang. I have frankly no idea what they did on Xinjiang. I think they have a general figure for China that's not broken down. Next slide, please. So to reiterate, implicated in forced labor in Xinjiang, or at risk, we need to say, are potentially all sectors involving lower skilled labor-intensive work, especially manufacturing. Specifically, identified sectors exist, and that's very important: cotton, tomato, polysilicon. But the problem is not limited to specific sectors. And that is one of the also cases where Xinjiang is distinct from Uzbekistan. The problem is more systemic and endemic because the state pursues political goals, not just economic ones. Next slide, please. Because we cannot merely be limited to specific sectors, we need to argue or base ourselves on the presumption that all raw materials and products from Xinjiang that involve lower skilled labor-intensive work of any kind, and this system is being upgraded, so higher skilled sectors are increasingly at risk. I do have a report on this, and I can't get into the details. So the risk is increasing, but this is the baseline risk, are potentially tainted with forced labor. We therefore, ideally, really need a reversal or burden of proof of forced labor. That's what I argued in the hearing at the Congressional Executive Commission on China in October 2019 in Washington, D.C. And thankfully, my suggestion was adopted and put into law as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which reverses the burden of proof. And something similar has to be done here, however it's done. There's probably ways to tweak it. For example, Uzbekistan, all cotton is potentially tainted. It makes no sense to try to differentiate between cotton fields. Yeah? But the outright boycott of Uzbek cotton was successful, right? Because it targeted the whole thing. You couldn't go from one field to the next and say, oh, maybe. No, you had to target the entire problem. and put it under the presumption of a risk. Next slide, please. I have to skip this one out of respect for time. You can read it in my research report. So if you investigate Xinjiang forced labor, you can't just go to a factory. The factory might look like any other factory in Xinjiang. They are securitized. There is a fence. There is controlled access. They say it is normal in Xinjiang to guard against terrorism. It is probably increasingly normal in China, right? So you need to investigate the system of state-sponsored forced labor. You need to go to the villages where the recruitment works. You need to actually do like an anthropological research of the social context. Sorry. I make my own mistakes, so you'll forgive me. And that's what you need to do. Next slide, please. So what about the proposed EU instrument against forced labor? The key approach, to reiterate it, is this proposed risk database approach. Xinjiang has to be designated as a risk area. My question is, how far does it go? Does it lower the burden of proof sufficiently? So this would be a challenge I would put to lawmakers. Xinjiang has to be designated as a risk area, but the concept of risk area spelled out in the proposed legislation has to be effective and strong enough to tackle this scenario that I have just described. Second, time factor. 2 years gives Beijing a lot of time to even further clean up in Beijing, remove even more evidence of coercion. Uyghurs are already getting used to the labor context. The slide I skipped talked about how forced labor transfer is being institutionalized and normalized. These Uyghurs have been transferred for multiple years, and the government can just say, well, they've been working in this factory for years. They're just factory workers. This is just normal, right? It's no longer a new thing. And I think that's also why China signed the 2 ILO conventions this year, because they're ready for it. Just like letting Michelle Bachelet visit Xinjiang in 2022, they were ready. They were not ready in 2018. Tainted supply chains. Xinjiang input materials are widely used in Asian supply chains, especially, of course, the textile industry. So that's a major challenge to tackle with EU legislation. Final slide. Next slide. So we need a robust risk database system, designated areas effectively requiring importers to demonstrate the absence of forced labor. The time factor. I think 2 years is a lot of time. I do understand, of course. One proposal really would be to not have this on a national level, but to have an EU institution, an EU agency that does the whole thing for every country rather than 27 national entities, which I think is very unhelpful. And so you could reduce the time frame for designated risk areas because it's easier to identify, because you know this is a state-sponsored forced labor system, like Uzbekistan was until 2021. And then investigating tainted supply chains, which requires extensive tracking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this is a very helpful report. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the joke.
No. It's sometimes these words, you're just, it's too difficult. Sorry, sometimes life is too difficult. But let's go to the second speaker, Ruslan Mathieu. You are the journalist and human rights defender from Turkmenistan. And since 2010, you are directing an independent media outlet, Turkmen News, in exile from the Netherlands. We haven't met before, but this is an interesting occasion. I think your news outlet is a major provider for information on what's happening in Turkmenistan. So thank you for that. You have been reporting on forced labor and child labor in the cotton harvesting in your country. So please, can you, in 7 minutes, tell us about what you have found out about forced labor in your country?
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Ruslan Mathieu. I'm the founder and editor of Turkmen News. It's an independent media and human rights organization based in the Netherlands, indeed. which is dedicated to promoting freedom of expression and the rule of law in Turkmenistan, my homeland, and unfortunately one of the most closed, censored, and repressive countries in the world. It is often compared to North Korea, and in many cases that comparison is very much justified. There is no press freedom in Turkmenistan, and all civil society activists are either imprisoned or are based overseas, just like me. We publish daily news from the country, investigate grant corruption and nepotism, and raise cases of human rights violations. Since 2013, we monitor the use of forced labor in Turkmenistan during the cotton picking season. We do this with the help of trained monitors and sources working in the public sector in Turkmenistan and who are also forced to pick cotton. They all work incognito due to fear of reprisals, which I'll get at the end of at the end of my presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, this shameful practice in the 21st century is entirely organized by the government of Turkmenistan. We have been carrying out this monitoring for 9 years with colleagues, and within this time we have collected hundreds, if not thousands, of audio-visual materials, the evidence that describes the top-to-down system of forced labor orchestrated by the government of Turkmenistan. The orders to harvest cotton till the last ball and before a certain date come from the central government in the capital in Ashgabat. The orders, then in order to meet the deadline, the local officials recruit pickers from among the public sector workers. Every year, the harvest involves tens of thousands of public sector employees, including teachers and doctors, who are forced to pick cotton under different threats, including termination of employment. Jobs in Turkmenistan are scarce, and the state remains the major employer. When cotton harvest begins, officials break down the staff into cotton shifts. The duration of the shift depends on the size of staff in that particular state organization, for example, a school or a hospital. On average, teachers and doctors have 3 days of cotton shift in a week, and that starts about in late August until the very end of November and sometimes even early December. While workers of the telecom, gas, water or electricity supply organizations can pick cotton themselves, hire replacement pickers or pay money to their supervisors to hire those replacements, school teachers and doctors do not have that choice. They are explicitly extorted money because it is obviously hard to replace a teacher at work or a doctor. The daily cotton fee is about 2 euros. We calculated that on average for the whole cotton picking season, a school teacher or a doctor has to pay around 100 euros to be free from cotton, which may not seem a lot of money, but given that their monthly wage is about 100 euros, that's a lot of money. Although forced child labor is not used anymore since 2007, when I was at school, I picked cotton. From September 1 up until about this time, every day we would be working in the cotton fields. That practice is not in place anymore since 2007. However, children between 9 and 16 years of age are often seen in the cotton fields. They either replace their parents who are public servants or pick cotton to help their families. As I said, in Turkmenistan, jobs are few and the wages are very, very low. Often teachers who are forced to pick cotton send their students in their place in exchange of money or good marks. Travel and working conditions, well, you probably see on the slides, people are transported in open trucks or in tractor trolleys just like cattle. Often the ride is 1 to 1.5 hours, and upon arrival to the cotton field, people are forced to pick 20 to 30 kilograms of cotton. People can get reprimanded for failing to pick that amount, but in the last few years, the cotton crop was so low that picking that amount was nearly impossible. Ladies and gentlemen, the government of Turkmenistan does not acknowledge the problem. They claim that cotton is harvested by machines, and if people are seen picking cotton, those are volunteers. But that is a lie. The secret police of Turkmenistan, and I'm asking the technician to move a few slides further. The secret police of Turkmenistan seek to silence our monitors and reporters, fabricating criminal cases against them and sending them to prison for many years. Next slide, please. In 2016, and one more. In 2016, our monitor, Gaspar Matalaev, was caught during this work. The police beat him to confess to a crime he had never committed. He was given 3 years in jail and served that term in full. You can see him on the left. Another example of the government's intolerance of criticism, Mr. Nurgeldi Khalikov, the man to the right, our longtime news contributor, was arrested after sharing a photograph of the WHO delegation in Ashgabat, which came to study Turkmenistan's COVID preparedness. A few months after, he was imprisoned for 4 years on false charges of fraud. And today, as I said, Turkmenistan does not like criticism. It tries to conceal. So to conceal that information about the use of forced labor, the police control and observe all pickup points where people gather in the morning to board buses or open trucks or tractor trolleys to be taken to the fields. Sometimes they even wear civilian clothes and travel to the cotton fields with the forced laborers to see who is speaking to each other, who's taking photographs, or trying to raise issues of forced labor. I'll stop here, and we'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you for this. And I think it's a sad story, but it's an easy bridge to make to your neighbor, Raluca Dimitriescu, who's the coordinator of the Cotton Campaign, a coalition of human rights, NGOs, trade unions, brand associations, responsible investors and academics who unite to end the forced labor in the cotton production. I think you have been in the forefront of this fight against state-imposed forced labor and child labor in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So, Raluca, for you the question, can you tell us about the work of your campaign? How are you active and how are you addressing these issues, stories from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan on forced labor? Can you enlighten us in 7 minutes too? Thank you.
I'll do my best. I was hoping that maybe Ruslan took a bit less from his time so I can compensate with 2-3 extra minutes. But thanks, Agnes, and thanks for that introduction. It means I can already skip through my first slide. That's great. First, thank you for inviting us, both me and Ruslan, to be on this panel. And like Ruslan, so he's already provided you with an overview, right, of the forced labor situation in cotton production in Turkmenistan. We know that all the cotton originating in Turkmenistan is produced within a state-controlled system of forced labor. And we know, again, that the system is really under very strict control from the government, coordinated from the top down. So now really the question is really through which routes does Turkmen cotton enter the EU, and how can we improve the EU Commission's proposal for an import ban to ensure that it is really effective in banning Turkmen cotton from entering the EU. And like I said, this is the first slide. I'm not going to stay too much on it. Thanks, Agnes, for the lovely introduction. Indeed, we've conducted this work in Uzbekistan now for already 15 years, and I know that some of the speakers have already mentioned the boycott of Uzbek cotton. For those of you who are not familiar with that, that was a boycott maintained in place for over 12 years by civil society and global brands. Over 300 brands had committed to not use Uzbek cotton in their products as long as it's made with forced labor. That was effective. Let me tell you that it wasn't just a thing on its own. It was part of a much wider advocacy campaign and a campaign bringing together accountability actions towards the government of Uzbekistan. But it worked really well as a good political tool. And I can tell you that now when we talk about Turkmenistan, we have way more tools at hand, legal tools. For example, this import ban we are discussing now. So we're really hoping that using it can accelerate the progress that we've seen with Uzbekistan, and we're hoping we'll see the same in Turkmenistan, but in a much shorter period. So let's just skip through this and let me dive into the issue at hand. I'm going to share with you findings of our supply chain research that shows how forced labor Turkmen cotton enters the EU. And then based on the data we have, I will make a few recommendations as to how to improve the EU Commission's proposal to make sure that the situation we're seeing with Turkmen cotton is effectively addressed. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So I mentioned the supply chain, and Ruslan as well mentioned the supply chain, and there's a big element that global brands play in here. And I think it's really crucial that before we discuss the recommendations we have for this proposal, it's really important that everybody understands what are the stages through which cotton is turned into clothes, towels, and bed sheets. Very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with this, first the cotton is grown on cotton farms. Then after it is harvested, it is ginned at the gins. This is what's happening at the gins. That's where the cotton is cleaned and the seeds are removed. Then the ginned cotton is spun into threads, which we call yarn, and this process takes place at spinning mills. You can see it's the third icon from the left. Then the yarn is woven into fabric, and this happens at the fabric mills. And finally, the fabric then becomes finished goods. And what does it mean? This means that the fabric is dyed, it is cut into specific patterns, accessories are attached to it, etc. And this is the final stage of production. And after this, the finished goods are delivered to the global brands that buy these products. And the issue we're seeing with supply chains, and in particular the cotton supply chain at the moment, is that each stage of production often takes place in a different country. So with the actors at the top of the chain, which are the global brands and retailers in this case, they are only interacting with the cut, make, trim facilities, so the last bit of the supply chain that you see in that graphic. And for that, the cotton supply chain remains deeply opaque, and as a result, because the brands have no transparency and they have no traceability of their supply chains, this fragmentation of the cotton supply chain has made companies at the top, until now, avoid accountability for the labor rights violations that are taking place further down the supply chain. And we believe very strongly that a forced labor import ban, like the one we're discussing now in the context of the EU, plays really a key role in addressing these issues in terms of traceability or lack of traceability and transparency. So go to the next slide, please. And now I will share some of the supply chain research data I have told you about. These are just some examples. So again, these are not, this provides an idea of what's happening out there, but the examples are way more numerous than what I put here on the slide. And this is based on public information data that's available in the UN Comtrade and OEC databases. So for all you researchers out there, feel free to dig into it. There's way more than what's on this slide. So first here, I am presenting examples of EU countries that are directly importing finished products. So these are garments or home textiles from factories in Turkmenistan. Because Turkmenistan not only exports raw cotton, but it also processes the cotton in the country and exports what we call finished goods. So for example, Italy in 2020 imported finished goods made with forced labor Turkmen cotton with a value of over $250,000. And these imports directly coming from Turkmenistan would be the easiest to track and ban under an EU forced labor ban. Next slide, please. This slide shows that EU countries also import fabric directly from Turkmenistan. So Italy, Portugal, and Poland, you can see here, they import fabric. And this fabric is most likely then used in the production of finished goods in the same countries, which are then bought by global brands and retailed all over the world. And here on this slide, I also want to draw your attention to Turkey, which is a key finished goods producer for brands that are headquartered or are selling their products in the EU. And keep this example in mind as I move forward with the presentation, because I'll come back to it. Please, next slide. I know this is a lot of complex information. We'll provide the data to you, the presentation to you, and also I'll talk a bit more about the implications of this in a few moments. So here you can see examples of the countries that are importing forced labor Turkmen yarn. And again, we have EU countries directly importing from Turkmenistan, as well as third countries that produce textiles using yarn coming from Turkmenistan. And again, here you can see that Turkey stands out as a major importer, followed by Russia, China, and Pakistan. And if that's the alarm for me to stop, then I have a serious issue. Let's just move forward. Let's skip to the next slide. Again, examples of countries importing that. Yeah, let's stay just 10 seconds on this slide, because I was talking about what are the implications of this data, what does it really mean, especially for people that don't work with supply chains on a daily basis like we do. So first, the data is telling us that countries like Italy, Poland, and Germany are importing finished goods directly from Turkmenistan. And also countries like Portugal, Italy, and Poland are also producing finished goods with forced labor Turkmen cotton. Next. I'm not going to talk about this. It's a case study, Portugal. Again, we can share this with you, and you'll have more information. The second key point is it relates to the indirect imports that are coming to the EU from Turkmenistan. And here, a major risk is production in Turkey, because Turkey imports large quantities of cotton, yarn, and fabric. Go to the next, please. Very quickly here, you can see that Turkey imported over $94 million worth of yarn from Turkmenistan in 2020. And on this open base database website called Open Apparel Registry, some of you might be familiar with it, over 90,000 facilities are listed as producing clothes in Turkey for global brands like H&M, Inditex, Zara, Next, etc. So that's really a key risk that we need to look into further. And again, if you can skip now, here we had some recommendations specifically for how to amend the proposal to capture the complexities of the supply chain, specifically looking at the Turkmenistan case. I'm not sure if I'm going to have time to go into this, but very quickly we're calling for the legislation to allow for a scope for a regional ban. All cotton in Turkmenistan coming from Turkmenistan is produced with forced labor. There is no way to distinguish between good and bad suppliers. They're all in the same situation. The US, starting 2018, has already implemented a regional import ban. They're banning all cotton coming from Turkmenistan. They're banning all products made with cotton from Turkmenistan partially or fully. Next. Again, traceability and transparency requirements. I said the supply chain is notoriously opaque. How are the customs authorities going to know if a brand is using products coming from Turkey made with Turkmen yarn, right? So that's where we're calling for an obligation towards brands to map out supply chains. And very clear, let me be very clear that brands cannot prevent or remediate forced labor in Turkmenistan. So really the only way to make sure they don't have forced labor Turkmen cotton, forced labor cotton in their supply chains is to map out their supply chains and eliminate Turkmen cotton completely. Next. I know that human rights due diligence is mentioned in the proposed legislation, which is absolutely great. What we're calling for is an interpretation of this concept as both process-based and a result-oriented obligation. So here I'm talking about very specific examples, like for example, if a brand is asked what are they doing for due diligence to make sure their products are not made with forced labor Turkmen cotton, it's really not enough for a brand to just provide their code of conduct or their policies saying, well, our spinning mills are prohibited from using Turkmen cotton. You really have to look at a result-oriented process covered by human rights due diligence. What is that brand really doing? How are they really engaging their spinning mills to make sure Turkmen cotton is eliminated from production?
Can you now Yeah,
I think what's next? I think that's it.
that's it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, this is an obvious point, I'm hoping, effective cooperation between border authorities across jurisdictions, because we're calling for a level playing field, and it would make no sense that the EU does something in isolation from what the US is doing or from what Canada is doing, and they should really share information and make that information public in terms of what are suspected importers, what are the suspected exporters, of forced labor Turkmen cotton, because again, these are the same brands operating in the same markets globally, right? So it makes sense to attack them.
To coordinate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for this extensive but very good story. And I saw my right-hand neighbor nod when you're saying you should have a regional ban and not a product. So there you are already on the same page. And let's move now to my left-hand neighbor. Andy Hall, a well-known human rights defender. You're also campaigning for migrant workers' rights. And you are active in empowerment and modern-day slavery. I think since 2018 you've been focusing on the forced labor issues which are being faced by migrant workers in Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, Malaysia, especially during the COVID-19 crisis. So, Andy, can you perhaps, also in 7 minutes, tell us a little bit about your investigation on the Malaysian gloves industry, how it started, how it's going, what we can learn from that. Andy, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I've been working for a long time linking the migrant worker abuses to the global supply chains, particularly looking at the US because of the ability to access the customs data in the US. So whenever we find abuses in factories, in Thailand and Malaysia, mostly my focus, we often go to the US customs data and we can find very clear, transparent information about which brands and which customers are buying from those factories. So it's something which the EU doesn't have, actually, this kind of customs data. So actually, in the work that I do, I use methods of escalation. So it starts very much from encouraging workers to engage their employers, engaging industry associations, using local mechanisms, legal and political mechanisms, engaging buyers, brands, investors, diplomats, including the EU missions overseas, and then UN agencies. Media is a very important tool. And then finally, this, since about 2018, engaging with the CPB, the US Customs and Border Protection Authority. And that's really been a useful method. So I'm just going to explain very briefly what happened. So in 2018, I've actually been working on issues related to public procurement and gloves for many years. But in 2018, I went to to Malaysia and found a really terrible situation with the gloves industry. And because I had quite a lot of media leverage, I exposed this issue like internationally. At the time when international organizations were talking about responsible public procurement, and at the same time the situation in the gloves industry was terrible. So I worked with the media and with diplomats and with companies and different organizations, and there was kind of, I would say that was a stage one kind of campaign, and it improved a lot. There was a lot of improvements in the industry, and migrant workers got their passports returned, they had more freedom of movement, they had less working hours, and some of these forced labor indicators were removed. But one of the big issues facing migrant workers in Malaysia, as you said, from Nepal, from India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, was that they had debt from forced labor from the recruitment fees that they'd paid, some of them up to about $5,000. And we just couldn't get any leverage with these companies and with the brands and with the buyers to actually pay back this money to the workers. And it was only because of the CPB that came on board in 2018, and they came on board and they said, look, this is forced labor because it's debt bondage and the workers are not free. And they imposed the first sanctions on the Malaysian gloves industry. And the first case was a small case. It didn't have that much impact. But the second case, which Rosie is going to talk about, was the biggest glove company in the world. And once they had these sanctions imposed on them, it was kind of like a domino effect, which within about 8 to 9 months resulted in about $150 million being paid back to migrant workers in Malaysia who had paid that money on recruitment fees. And that was essentially a result of the US ban that was imposed on many of the gloves companies in Malaysia. And it resulted in immediately no court systems, it was a very easy system whereby the industry itself felt that they were going to face sanctions. They couldn't export into the US, and that resulted in $150 million being paid back. And it also, a really improvement in conditions for the workers, a change of culture throughout the industry. And this happened at the same time at which the EU ambassador to Malaysia was saying, actually, we need 24-hour 24/7 gloves production, So there was a letter that was leaked by the EU ambassador to Malaysia saying to the Malaysian government, look, we just need more gloves. And there was not a single mention in that letter to the government about decent work and things like that. And it really showed the difference of approaches. And it's something which really is untapped, because as an activist, when we do this kind of work on the ground, when we're trying to find links with global supply chains, it's really hard to rely on the European Union and European buyers and European governments, because there's no tools like there was in the US. So it really had a very big impact. But the role of the CPB sanctions have been a little bit weakened, and because the main strength was in the deterrence. People believed that if they didn't improve the situations in the gloves factories, they would face the sanctions. They couldn't export to the US, and that had a huge deterrent impact. But actually, the sanctions regime in the US, the CPB, is quite opaque, it's not very transparent, and there's a lot of irrationality that occurs in the process. So actually, as an activist, and also other people, unionists and other people working in this area, we found it quite hard to trust the CPB mechanisms, because we never know what's going to happen. We put this information in, but we don't really have a clarity. There's no clear time frames. There's no clear criteria. How to impose the sanctions, how to lift the sanctions. And so it's actually a very confusing process, which, although we have to say it's been really powerful, it's been really beneficial, and it's a great tool, but the EU is really in a situation to learn from the strengths and weaknesses of the US mechanisms. The Canada, a few people have mentioned Canada also had they also have a system, but actually it was created 2 years ago and it hasn't been utilized because there's not really a strong political will in Canada. So it's a challenge. And then, the remediation is the very important thing here. Actually, the US system doesn't require remediation. It just requires that forced labor finishes, So if you have an abusive situation in a factory, the US impose sanctions and they say you have to remediate the forced labor in the sense that you have to stop the forced labor. So once you've stopped the forced labor, you don't have to remediate the victims, There's nothing in the US legislation, but it's led to remediation in recruitment fees, because recruitment fees put workers in debt bondage, therefore they're in forced labor. So if they're in debt, then you have to pay back the money. Once you pay back the money to them, they're not in debt, therefore they're not in forced labor, therefore the sanctions get lifted. And that's an issue with the EU legislation, with the draft regulation, is that it doesn't talk about remediation. So it just says, okay, once you have this situation, you can't sell your goods, and you need to improve the situation, but it doesn't talk about remediation. And there really is a need to effectively remediate forced labor. And even in Malaysia, we've seen the repayment of $150 million of recruitment fees, but we haven't seen the effective remediation of workers for forced labor. They were in forced labor for decades, really suffering, and we haven't seen that coming about. There's also been a lot of a lack of international solidarity, because when the US imposed sanctions on gloves companies, they just sold to Europe, or they just sold to Canada or Australia. They just shifted the market because of that. And the CPB is not very proactive on the ground. They don't have their own investigators who go to the ground, which is something that's mentioned in some of the draft regulations. And actually, one of the interesting things about the CPB, and they actually said to us, don't publicize your complaints, because we just want to impose sanctions on the companies without telling them we're even investigating them. So the CPB actually imposes sanctions, and the first thing that a company will hear that they're actually being investigated is when the sanctions are imposed. And that's a really different system to the one that the EU is proposing, with a lot more kind of checks and balances and more transparency and more natural justice. Civil society engagement with the CPB mechanisms have been really limited. And there's a lot of concerns about the political dynamics here. Who does CPB focus on? What areas do they focus on? Final comment is public procurement is a huge issue, particularly in Europe. 16% of GDP or more is public procurement, but none of these bans actually are focusing on public procurement. They're just focusing on the private sector. So there's a lot of areas to expand on in terms of public procurement. So just to summarize, I mean, the EU has a lot to learn from the US system, both its strengths and its weaknesses. But on the ground, as an activist, as someone working in this area, the CPB tools have been, you know, just so important to bring about massive remediation, massive culture change, massive improvement for workers on the ground. And so it would be really important that the EU can develop a tool like this, because it's a real great weapon for communities, for workers, for people who are facing situations of forced labor. It's really a support that the EU can give to these people to help them to fight against their situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for this very clear plea. And you already mentioned the last speaker in our panel. She's called Rosie Hurst. She's the founder and managing director of Impacts, which is an independent consultant specializing in ethical trade. Ethical trade practices, human rights, labor practices. You've been working with your company, with the Malaysian company Top Glove, to remediate their forced labor in its operation. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your experience and what we can learn from that. Rosie, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to jump straight into the practicalities about how this thing actually works. So we're talking here about the private sector forced labour. This isn't at all to do with the state-sponsored forced labour, which, as Adrian and others have said, is irremediable in terms of a enterprise-by-enterprise approach. So we're talking about private sector forced labour, which is enabled by labour market regulation, likely about migrant workers. And these are the kind of situations you see in any country where there is reliance on migrant labour. And that can be in Germany in meat factories, it can be in the UK in farms, but it's also in Malaysia in the rubber glove industry. So I've been working in this field for 25 years, and I have never seen anything as effective as the US Tariff Act for changing corporate behaviour. So the company Top Glove we knew before, as we knew all the other glove manufacturers in Malaysia, and we have been saying for some time, look, this is forced labour, you've got all 11 indicators, something has to change. And we'd made some tiny progress, sometimes by working with coalitions of buyers in order to provide a little bit of pressure. But it was only when US CBP used that stranglehold of you can't import your products anymore that we saw real change. And the change we saw was fascinating and wide-ranging on a number of levels. Number one, my client Top Glove wholeheartedly took on looking the problem in the face. So for them, they were doing nothing different from what was legal in Malaysia and what was absolutely common practice, right? It wasn't their own idea that this was forced labour. But what they did was commissioned us to look at all 11 indicators of forced labour, and we found all 11 indicators of forced labour. They looked at that and they decided, because they couldn't import gloves into the United States, that they were going to change all that. And so it had a seismic effect. As Andy said, it resulted in the repayment actually at Top Glove of $38 million to around 16,000 people, including people who had already left the company. So it was backdated by a couple of years. And that's probably the single largest repayment by a single company for anything in the human rights field ever in the history of the world. And that was accomplished pretty quickly over a period of 6 to 9 months. But they also spent a total of 150 million also on things like upgrading accommodation, changing management practices, etc., etc., etc. So it was possible for us to say, after about 8 to 18 months, that there are now no longer systemic indicators of forced labour present at Top Glove. And that's published. You can look on our website and see that opinion. So what made that happen? What made that happen was the blockage. So the messages that I would give to you are as follows. Number one, make sure that whatever you do is not too consultative, because US CBP and many other people consulted for a long time with companies in Malaysia, and it didn't make any difference, or only resulted in changes to policy, not changes to practice. So make sure that the instrument is sharp and that it cuts, because in the end, it is that makes change. Number two, remember that one person's standard industry practice is another person's forced labour. So in making my first point, I am not saying don't talk to other countries about the way that they manage their labour markets and indicate to them what the risks are, because much of this is regulatory. Third point is make sure that your instrument incentivizes real change, not paper change. So this is not seeing beautiful policies and beautiful handbooks. This is actually making sure that the workers in an organization are not themselves experiencing any of the 11 indicators of forced labour. And remember, this is not about compliance with a standard, it's experiential. Are people experiencing those indicators, or are they not experiencing them? Number 5, require remedy. Now, the Tariff Act doesn't actually require remedy, but it is constituted in such a way that remedy is what you need to do to get off. But I think we can be much more specific about requiring remedy and draw on technical guidelines that say what remedy actually is. So, in the case of repayment of recruitment fees, how much do you need to repay? Over what time period? To whom? How do you calculate it when there are no receipts? There are now guidelines in the public domain. We have a set of guidelines which set that out. In terms of improving accommodation, you know, the IFC guidelines, but be very, very specific so you can measure change. Right, next one, number 5, there's only one more, redemption. So redemption is crucial. So when a company has remediated, they should be led back into the room garlanded with roses, not further punished. This is quite hard to do because mud sticks, but if this is to work, those who change their ways and improve things should be praised, and they shouldn't have mud thrown at them, which is why I commend Top Glove, because Top Glove are going around the world speaking about their experience, and they should be praised for that because they have made a big change. And then the last point is, clearly, this sort of regulation is very labour intensive. So you have to investigate an organisation, and then you have to hold the organisation's hand or shout at them, or whatever your preferred mode is, and then you have to check whether they've done it or not. So obviously, it's hard to do that across a large number of organisations at once. But the Top Glove case demonstrates that now there is a whole layer of industry in Malaysia who has done probably about half of what Top Glove has done in order to avoid being sanctioned. So that is quite an impressive ripple approach from this. So I think that's all I wanted to say, but I am delighted that you're pursuing this, and please go in and go in hard. Thank you.
And I think this is exactly what we are intending to do. Huh? Go in and go in hard. With an eye on the clock, and with I'm also looking at Alessandra. I'm skipping the Q&A because people deserve a cup of coffee and need to be back in the room at what time? 5? Okay. Because then the second panel is after this fact-finding mission. Thank you for all these facts. Thank you also for your recommendations for the legislation. Talk about the legislation and how to move forward, like I said. We intend to go into it hard and fast. You have been very helpful for this. And if you have a question to one of the people in this panel, use the coffee break. Coffee is served over there to ask your questions. And now my only request to you is, can you give them a big hand of applause for their stories?
Dear friends, is it possible to... Dear friends, it isn't working at all. Hallo, hallo.
Oh, I was moved away from you.
Okay. Yes, where are you? Okay, good. I didn't know Danish women had such a powerful voice, Crystal. Yeah, I'm sorry to pull you back from a nice coffee break, but we only have like a decent 50 to 55 minutes. We have a big panel, and I do absolutely want to have time for you to ask questions, because we, within the S&D, we organize events not to make a monologue, but a dialogue. So that's why I was a little bit strict to get you back. So let me welcome you back all after the coffee break. You can still finish your coffee and the nice cookies that were with it. I must say the first panel was extremely interesting, and it's very good to have these highlights, these very practical examples of nearly 28 million of cases of forced labor worldwide. That is a figure that is absolutely shocking. What I would want to do in the second panel is now really get a focus on the proposal of the European Commission in front of us. That is important because we will start working on that proposal in different committees. We're not yet sure which is the leading committee. You know, in the Parliament, that's always a big discussion. Not interesting for the outside world, but internally, of course, of some interest. But the main thing is that we, as an S&D, would want to take the lead on this issue. And not just today. We did that already for years. We've been the political group taking firm stances on these issues and demanding from the European Commission to come up with a proposal, which they finally did. And we welcomed that proposal. And I'm not going to go in all the details, but it is important that the objective of the proposal in front of us is to prohibit the placing and making available on the EU marking and the export, and that is important, also from the EU products made with forced labor within the EU. So it goes both ways. That makes it more complex, let that be clear, and complexity is an issue when you talk about enforceability, so we have to take that into account. But I think it is important. We cannot just put our finger up for the rest of the world and not take our own responsibility on our own internal markets. The member states will have to require to designate a competent authority, and then there's a full, sort of process that's been described within the proposal. There's a pre-investigation, an actual investigation, then a decision that to be made, and then of course, Mr. Glucksmann. The competent authority must then, at the end, inform its decision to the customs authority. The proposal complements existing horizontal and sectoral EU initiatives, and that's also one of the reasons why we have Lara here with us, because she's our hero on due diligence and the importance of the connection of both of them. Before I start, can I just take a few takeaways, take a takeaway from the first panel. For all the panelists already here, there was an issue about child labor, and also I think it's of interest. We have now a clear focus on forced labor, but the question was, isn't all child labor a form of forced labor, and shouldn't we be very clear on that? Do we need adjustments to the proposal? The second remark in the first panel was that the Commission's proposal is really focusing on businesses and how they operate, and rightly so. But businesses, as we know, their main objective is to maximize, well, most of the businesses to maximize their profit, and that's why they, from time to time, turn a blind eye when it comes to forced labor. Something else, when you talk about political activity of, let's say, a country like China, that is not about companies. This is really about a political system and oppression of certain minorities. Is the proposal of the European Commission strong enough? And the third issue that is, I think, also very key is this proposal good enough in the enforceability? Because everything at the end comes up to, can we enforce these really wonderful ideas? Let me start the panel, and I would want you to restrict to 5 minutes. I know that is not easy, but if we do that, we have like another 20. If we do that, Raphael, then our audience can ask questions. And as I said, when you were not yet here, in the S&D we work on dialogue, not just monologue. Voilà, I turn to Mrs. Hélène de Rangervé. Look, I should be able to do that. I can speak French, but I wanted to pronounce that in an English sort of way, so je m'excuse. Business and Human Rights Manager at the Anti-Slavery International. And Hélène, let me start. You're the first on our panelists. What is your view on the Commission proposal? Where do you see, well, the opportunities, but also where will it fall short, and what will we have to do in the European Parliament to reinforce further the Commission proposal? 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. So dear Chair, dear members of the European Parliament, dear persons here that are interested in the subject, very nice to all see you and to see this room full. My name is Hélène de Rangervé, sorry, French name, very difficult to pronounce. I'm not the Business and Human Rights Manager, she's actually there. I'm just a senior EU advisor at Anti-Slavery International, which is considered as the oldest human rights organizations in the world. From my previous colleagues, you've heard stories about Turkmenistan, Malaysia, and the Uyghur region that describes well the situation and the scope of the challenge that is ahead of us. I won't get back on the global estimates. I think they've been cited a few times. For Anti-Slavery International, it is essential that the regulation needs to be revised with workers in mind. They are the ones that needs to be protected first and for all. As such, the product ban is only a vessel, it's not the destination. And to live up to its political commitment to eradicate forced labor, the EU must incentivize meaningful action against forced labor and its root causes, not only with raw products made with forced labor from the EU market. The forced labor regulation is just a good start, but it needs a thorough upgrade. Being one among many speakers, I will focus only on 4 points. The need for wider bans to address meaningfully the scope of state-imposed forced labor, the ethical duty to suspend the circulation of goods during the investigation, the shift on when to focus on due diligence towards the full investigation stage, and the need for remediation as a critical element. First, we need a much clearer scope for wider bans beyond singular products. The law must be able to target products from entire production entities, importers, and industry groups in regions. In particular, as was said earlier, we need to create a mechanism to ban a whole group of products from a specific region. For example, cotton from Turkmenistan or solar panel from the Uyghur region, as it is the only way to meaningfully address the state-imposed forced labor. Second, we need goods to be seized during the investigation to prevent their circulation until a formal decision is made. We've heard earlier from Mrs. Garcia Perez that it was a moral duty, and it is indeed morally unacceptable that products under investigation for substantiated claims of forced labor would be allowed to circulate freely in the EU market. Third, due diligence must be removed from the pre-investigation stage. Due diligence should not be used as a shield against opening an investigation. The decision to investigate must solely focus on whether a claim is substantiated. Due diligence efforts should be considered, but during the investigation stage, in particular to prevent unintended consequences. But the focus needs to be on remediation measures, not all kinds of due diligence. For example, do companies have systems in place to ensure that workers receive remediation? Can credible representatives of workers verify this? So last but not least, it is critical that the regulation is designed to drive remediation for workers. We need to see remediation included as a standalone process in the regulation itself, with clearer requirements also on how a product ban could be lifted, far beyond the vague language in the proposal on the elimination of forced labor. The lifting of a ban must be tied to remediation and to clear verified steps to prevent forced labor to reoccur in the future. The latter must go beyond audits and certification processes and must involve direct engagement with workers and their credible representatives. We heard in a previous event from the Commission that remediation should be dealt with through the Anti-Trafficking Directive. Along with PICOM and La Strada International, of whom Anti-Slavery International is a member, we see three key concerns here. First, the lack of legal guidance, the absence of alternative offences, and the high threshold of evidence prevents many serious cases of severe form of labour exploitation to be prosecuted and recognised as trafficking in human beings. Furthermore, as assistance and protection are often tied to successful prosecution, many victims who do not wish to participate in the justice process for fear of retaliation, very often, have no access to justice or support. Second, even though migrant workers are particularly at risk of exploitation also in the EU, the Commission or EU member states are making little efforts under the Anti-Trafficking Directive to ensure adequate working conditions for them. Thus, the very first step there would be to ensure that the protection of labour laws would prevail for all workers, irrespective of their migration and residence status. Third, the directive concerns only EU-based victims and do not allow access to justice for workers exploited in non-EU countries, which is a clear gap. So overall, we need a law which is designed with workers at the heart. The EU has an enormous opportunity to show global leadership to end forced labour in supply chains, but if you fail to improve the initial proposal for this regulation, it stands at risk of simply failing millions of workers and people from oppressed communities around the world. So I encourage and hope that the S&D group will indeed play an active role in improving the proposal. Thank you.
Rest assured, we will.
I immediately turn to Mr. Gambini, Antonio, European Lobby and Advocacy Coordinator at the Clean Clothes Campaign. More or less the same question to you, please. Antonio.
Thank you so much. Of course, my thanks to the S&D group for organizing this very relevant workshop and for inviting me to say a few words. So at the Clean Clothes Campaign, we were a global network and we work on, our main goal is defending fundamental rights of workers and empowering workers to improve working conditions in the garment sector. So obviously, forced labor is a priority for us, and we are very happy to see this proposal on the table. But we do believe there is a lot of room for improvement. First of all, I'm not going to repeat everything that Elena said on the issue of remediation for workers, but I'm definitely going to voice my support for what she said. I will try to focus on three areas of concern. First is the issue of rerouting of forced labor tainted exports. So obviously we live in a global market with global supply chains. So in this global market, if one market bans such imports, obviously there is at least a temptation for operators to reroute exports to where they are not banned. So actually this is a bit the situation we are living right now, because in the USA, as we heard, there is some kind of system and the EU is still working on it. But the problem of rerouting of exports is not only international, but it's also a problem in the proposed regulation as such. So we heard from Hélène again the problem of lack of temporary measures such as suspension during the investigation. So obviously during the investigation operators are totally free to reroute, reorganize their exports in order to sell everything they want. The other problem in terms of rerouting is the highly decentralized system here. So basically the system, both in terms of investigation and enforcement, is based on 27 different national authorities. Obviously, the 27 national authorities, which obviously will have slightly different interpretations, approaches, and at the very least, different administrative capacity. So how can we ensure that operators will not take advantage of this diversity? This, of course, we are very worried about that. In the proposal, the system to solve conflicts of competence is the creation of the lead authority. Who is the lead authority? Is the first of the 27 authorities that officially opens an investigation. Is that enough of a system to ensure coherence? We are not so sure. Another issue extremely important for us is the issue of transparency of supply chains. So there was a very, very recent, a few days ago, a report by the Dutch organization and research center SOMO who studied the level of transparency of the supply chains of 100 companies in the leather, garment and footwear sector. Conclusion, only 29 companies publish some information about their suppliers, and amongst those, only 17 publish information beyond the first tier of suppliers. So this result, in a sense, is worrying, because it proves that at this point, transparency in supply chains is the exception. It's not the rule. But it's also a bit a reason to be optimistic. Why? Because more transparency is possible, and some companies are trying to do it. Now, in this regulation, the Article 10, if I remember correctly, allows any natural or regular person or association to submit information to competent authorities, as kind of a complaint mechanism. We welcome this opportunity. We are very happy about that. And my organization, we are imagining on how we can use this. And many others are also imagining this, and possibly, why not? Maybe workers themselves who are victims of forced labor might also want to take advantage of this article. Yes, theoretically. But if there is no transparency, how can we submit information? How can we know what's happening in the supply chain? So increasing transparency in supply chains would be extremely beneficial, but also for companies. Nearly finished. SMEs, for instance, would be might be able more easily to source in a way free from forced labor. And in the proposed regulation, of course, when there is an investigation, the operator has to reveal to the investigative authority details about the supply chain. It's good, but it's not enough. Such information should be publicly disclosed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and also for your diplomatic way of putting things, like 27 member states that slightly have a different interpretation. That is very interesting, I have to say. I go now to Jeffrey Vogt. He's online. Jeffrey Vogt is Rule of Law Director at the Solidarity Center, allied with the AFL-CIO, the largest federation of unions in the US. And Jeffrey, for you, the obvious question is, when you look to the US initiative and the proposal now of the European Commission, where do you see the differences, the challenges, the advantages of one or the other? Also, 5 minutes. Jeffrey, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'll be as brief as I can, and sorry I can't be with you in person on the ILO governing body in its session. So I'm stuck here in Geneva. So thank you for the question. I think both models have certainly things to recommend them, both strengths and weaknesses. So I'll go into those very briefly right now. I would say, and some of the previous speakers have already touched on some of these points. I'd say perhaps the greatest difference between the two approaches are in the investigation procedures. In the U.S., if a petitioner provides evidence of forced labor under a reasonable belief standard, it will trigger the CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, to take a more comprehensive investigation, including fact-finding and further conversation with the petitioner. If the CBP is satisfied that there is a reasonable belief of forced labor, it will issue a withhold and release order, meaning that goods can be detained at any port of entry in the United States. This doesn't mean that the goods cannot be permitted entry, but it rather shifts the burden of proof to the importer to prove that the goods were not made in whole or in part with forced labor. And in the case of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that's been legislated to create a rebuttable presumption that those goods are in fact made with forced labor. While CBP may make a definitive finding, meaning a conclusive determination that such goods are made in whole or in part with forced labor, it really has done so in a few cases. To the contrary, the EU approach is quite different. First, it would appear from my reading that the burden of proof remains on the petitioner and or the competent authority to establish conclusively that a good was made in whole or in part with forced labor. When a determination has been made, the economic operator, after the preliminary investigation and the actual investigation, may request a review of the finding, although it just had the opportunity to present evidence, and may also avail itself of courts to challenge the procedural or substantive basis of that determination, which doesn't appear to be available actually to a petitioner. Furthermore, the economic operator can claim its due diligence policy as what would appear to be a mitigating factor or a potential shield from the prohibition of placing or making available its goods on the market. While, of course, we support human rights due diligence, one would expect that an economic operator that had exercised the due diligence already, or the diligence which was due, would have already identified potential or actually forced labor in its supply chains and either prevented, mitigated, or disengaged. So unclear what the fact of a due diligence policy and its implementation, if having not already detected the forced labor that is in its supply chain, how that is going to be factored in, particularly already at the preliminary investigation stage. And the EU approach appears to give small and medium enterprises and those with fewer resources quite a lot of latitude, both in the investigation stages as well as acting once a finding has been made. The U.S. approach is simply, if a good has been made with forced labor, it makes no difference really the size of the importer or whether it had a due diligence policy in place. I think the other significant difference is that the U.S. approach does not allow goods to enter the U.S., while the EU regulation, for understandable reasons, because this is also looking inwards, will allow goods to enter but not be sold. So it appears that this approach is to try to treat EU and non-EU goods alike, reducing potential claims of discriminatory treatment. But I think it will remain to be seen, whether this is a more effective approach. And also noting that under the regulation, or the economic operator has at least a month to act on a finding, and perhaps even longer for smaller companies, which could mean that they could actually be trying to sell off goods even after a finding for at least a month after the decisions have been made. Which was already mentioned in the U.S., a petitioner can seek a WRO not only on a single product line, but of all the goods coming from a particular country or region. This has been extraordinarily helpful when we're talking about state-sponsored or widespread forced labor. I do recognize that the regulation does provide for the establishment of a database of risks of good made with state-sponsored forced labor, but I think this is something quite different than the possibility of a regional or country-based ban on a particular product. I would say very quickly, because I realize I'm out of time, neither the US nor the EU model provides for effective remedies for workers who are victims of forced labor. In the US, the detention of prohibited goods will mean, of course, the potential loss of revenues for the importer and likely commercial repercussions for the importer supplier. And going forward, the detention of goods puts added pressure on importers to conduct better due diligence to ensure that their suppliers and their suppliers are not benefiting from forced labor. But for the workers whose exploitation served as the basis for the decision, there's no legal obligation to provide a remedy. And U.S. unions and NGOs have been pressing CBP to encourage, for example, proof of remedy as a basis to lift a WRO. And this would be an interesting approach. Further, neither the U.S. nor the EU model really centers workers and trade unions in the process. And as I actually separate comments on the EU due diligence directive, concern that workers and trade unions are not really centered within the due diligence directive as to labor rights concerns. And I would say the same is here. Without meaningful engagement with workers and unions throughout the process, 30 more seconds. I think the U.S. will miss opportunities to block the commercialization of forced labor-made goods. And a final point is I think international cooperation will be essential between the U.S., EU, and others for the effective application of all of our laws. Because if an importer is blocked in one right now, can, as Antonio mentioned, it can easily turn around and go somewhere else and dispose of the same goods. So transparency of data and transatlantic cooperation will be essential to making this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your relevant analysis between the two systems, and one is in place and the other still has to prove its effectiveness. And it's up to us, I think, in the European Parliament to decide how to improve and what would be the best and what will work, because as I said also in the introduction, it's also about enforceability. And for that, I have three excellent politicians on my right-hand side, for you the left-hand side. Yeah. And with pleasure, I start with Raphael. Raphael Glucksmann is a colleague of mine. Well, three of them are colleagues of mine and of us, but I mean in the INTA committee. But also in the DRAC committee, and I can say, I can absolutely honestly say that it's also due to the work of Raphael that we now have a proposal of the European Commission, the work and the hard, well, sometimes you shout even about the necessity, not today, but it is important. It's not by being very polite sometimes to the Commission that they will come up with proposals. And the fact that we have a proposal is also due to your hard work. You have also been our shadow on the initiative report. So your opinion is really very important, as you will also play an important role. Are your amendments already written, Raphael? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Actually, they're on the process of being at least thought about, because it's, let's first say it, I mean, the Commission at the beginning didn't want to do it. So now we can say that all of us have won something. At least we have something to debate, and we are in this room with a concrete thing to improve. And it's thanks to the work of the NGOs, of the activists, of the citizens that have shown how important it was for them. I mean, on certain campaigns against brands using Uyghurs as forced labor, hundreds of thousands of young French people mobilized themselves. I mean, it's really something that was carried out by the public and imposed. And I remember 2 years ago, I mean, the discussions were that with the Commission that it was too complicated, that we cannot do that. And then once Ursula von der Leyen came to the Parliament and said that we will do it. Then some people try to say, yeah, but we will sneak it in due diligence legislation in a way to make sure that both will be totally impossible to enforce. So it's a victory to have two different texts and to have the possibility to improve two different texts. And this is really, in our group, we always fight each other, but we can be proud to have made this a priority of the mandate, I mean, from the very beginning, and we will fight till the very end. So now that we have this, what can we say about this? What came from the Commission? First, the general philosophy can be perceived as okay because it's product-based. And that was a big stake. It has to be product-based. And now, all our goal should be to make it as sharp, coherent, efficient, ambitious as possible. And so changes needed were already mentioned. Helen, you spoke about the idea of group of products, the risk of re-export, how we detain goods during the investigation. I mean, this is key for us. And also the question of coherence, as Antonio has put it. I mean, 27 different authorities with 27 different approaches, then we all understand how it works. So Commission was a bit shy about its role and the role of the EU institutions, and so we won't be shy and make sure that there is EU supervision and coherence about all of that. Then the question that were not raised, I think that the question of deadlines, because you cannot accept just reasonable period of time as a deadline for investigation. I mean, it has to, we understand that there will be very different situations, but it has to be clear. Because otherwise, we know perfectly well that when we are not clear about deadlines, then it's endless processes. And it has to be cleared. Then the question of burden of proof was raised several times. And this is very clear that lack of clarity of this document on the level of proof that is required and on who has to prove is going to be a major problem. So our work will be to really put ourselves in the situation of how we enforce it. And that's why it's very important for us to have this discussion, but it will be also very important for us to go to custom officers, to go to national competent authorities, to discuss with them, to take the text and really screen it, how you will enforce it, how you will, what will you do with the goods, how you, do you have the information at the customs to actually look after the goods? Because technically, I mean, I spoke with the French customs authorities, they don't have it now, as we speak. So we need to make sure of that. We need also to make sure that all this process is used for actually cleaning already in preparation of the enforcement the value chains. Because when it will enter into force, if you are a solar panel importer, or even worse, you are working in solar selling solar panels to individuals, and then you don't know where it comes from, actually, now. Or you know, but you don't want to know. And this time frame, before it enters into force, should be used also to help companies to make sure that public authorities are accompanying them in the process of preparing themselves for the entry into force of this instrument. But one thing I want to say, and it's very important for us to keep in mind, we cannot solve all the issues in this specific text. So we have another text, which is due diligence. And it's very important for us because both are flagships for our group. I mean, that's really two fantastically important texts for our mandate. But we cannot put everything in this one, otherwise we might deprive him of enforceability, coherence, and strength. So that's my only reserve about some of the things, that this is not the magic thing. This is something that has to be efficient, and we will fight for it. And just one last word, it's a revolution, in fact. I mean, this ban, the discussion on due diligence, it's a revolution. It's the end of an era of weakness of the European Union. Now we have to turn the EU into a global normative power and to make sure that we use the fact that we are the first market in the world to actually put human rights into business and into facts. And this is a task that's huge, and I'm very proud that we make it the big priority of this mandate.
Thank you very much, Raphael. And next to you is Crystal. Crystal is our colleague from the IMCO committee, and we don't know yet how the balance will be between the two committees. And I'm not prejudiced, but I think it should be trade. I'm just kidding. What I think we absolutely need to do, we need to work very closely together. There is an INTA perspective to be given and an IMCO perspective, but let it be very clear, there's only one S&D perspective, whether it's IMCO or whether it's trade. So Crystal is also our coordinator in IMCO, so she has a very broad view. What are your main takeaways, and how would you want to further improve the proposal of the Commission?
Thank you very much for inviting me here today, the only IMCO person in the panel. However, I do believe it's a very important proposal, and there's no doubt that it is thanks to our group that we are here, that we have the proposal in place. But it doesn't mean that we cannot improve it, as we have heard. And seen from an IMCO perspective, I do believe that there are several things that could be improved. We have already heard some speakers talking about it, but let me start by saying that there's no doubt that we have this very good opportunity to stop products from entering into the EU market that is produced by forced labor, and we need to do something. This morning I heard in the radio, Danish radio, about flooding in Madagascar. And because of that, the children could not go to school. They were not able to get into the schools. So instead they were putting into the mines to take out minerals that we use to produce our electrical cars. This is very interesting, I believe, in terms of this proposal, because we really need to consider what we're doing here. It will have some impact also on our way of living, hopefully, because in that way we will consider how we do things. So either we will pay more for the product so adults can do it in a good, proper manner, or we will have to find other products, minerals, etc. around the world. So there's no doubt that we need to do something. So from an IMCO perspective, what can we do? A lot of the proposals are circulating around enforcement, sanctions, implementation. And I do believe that the main topic here is that if we have a good, strong regulation, we need to make sure that it is enforced. And do we make sure that the authorities have sufficient resources to control this? It is a never-ending story in IMCO when we work with legislation that we never ever have enough resources for the authorities. So we need to get more resources if we want to make sure that this proposal will be enforced in a good manner. Secondly, we heard some of the issues also early on. Maybe we could learn from the United States. I think that we should look into that. The reversed burden of proof could maybe be some of the things we could put in here. Why not oblige the suspected company itself to prove that the product is not produced by forced labor instead of going the other way around? That could be improved. I think that we need to create more incentives for companies also to make sure that they are looking into this so that they are not buying products or producing products from forced labor. I don't know how we can do it, but we need to do more. We have to discuss also what we do with products that are under investigation, as we've heard. And then I also have to say that this is some of the things we very often see from the Commission, that when we have proposals, they also tend to be very burdensome in the way they will be implemented. And I fear that the proposal here can be very burdensome and therefore be not worked on in a good manner. It might be complicated for companies, it might be complicated for authorities to look after. And I have to say that I think if it's possible to make it a little bit more precise, a little bit more clear, I think that could be beneficial as well. So many things that could be done. I think that we have to do it. I hope that we will be able to do it. One last thing. I think that the forum shopping is also a very important topic, that we need to make sure that no companies are choosing to place a product in a certain member state that might be the lowest enforcer, the one who has the fewest resources or the lack of will to enforce the rules in a good manner. So forum shopping is a classical problem for the internal market, and we need to make sure that this is not done here either. So therefore we need to find our ways to tackle that as well. So a lot of things to do still, even though the proposal in itself is a good start.
It's a good start, absolutely. And it's good that we have a proposal. Thanks a lot, Crystal. And finally, let me go to Lara. Lara is our due diligence hero here in the Parliament. She worked on the legislative INI and now will be actively working very much on the due diligence file. So that will be my main question. The connection between both of them, and you've heard previous speakers saying that maybe due diligence may be held as a sort of shield against opening an investigation. So we as Social Democrats, we look it as two very important complementary legislations, but we have to be very careful that they will not be used against each other. So, Lara, finally.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, and maybe just to start off that I have had a little bit of time to think about these contact points between due diligence and the forced labor ban, because the due diligence report is out today. So for anyone in this audience interested in it, it will make for some nice bedtime reading tonight. Certainly will make you fall asleep by page 144. Maybe just to pick up on where Raphael left off, and because we're nearing the end of the day, I think the positivity that you ended on is very important, because I think it's a very, very exciting time to be a progressive lawmaker in the European Parliament. And I think what we're doing here with the forced labor ban, with due diligence, with pieces like the taxonomy regulation, with things like CSRD, which is reporting and transparency requirements for companies, with measures in IMCO on the circular economy, on things like the Green Deal. At last, as Raphael said, we're putting our money where our mouth is, and I think that that's excellent. And all these puzzles are indeed complementary, as Kathleen said. The way that I see the contact points between these two pieces is, I think the sad truth is that by the time that you need a product ban, or by the time that you need to say at the customs that a product can't enter the EU, the human suffering has already taken place. And what we do in due diligence, of course, is we're trying to prevent, ideally, harm from happening by requiring companies to be more proactive in looking into their value chains. But there's a difference there in that, ideally, with due diligence, we will prevent. If not, we've got measures for that too. There's liability and there's teeth. But ideally, of course, the idea there is to prevent. And here, with the ban, what we can do is we can take action when, unfortunately, it is already too late. That's an important, I think, distinction, but it's a distinction also that is mutually reinforcing, because what was talked about in the beginning was this due diligence defense. So what you do when your product is stopped at the border, when you get a call from the office of the customs that says, well, you need to prove that your product wasn't made with forced labor. I think there, the good thing is that in due diligence, you need to know your value chain, and you need to show what you're doing about addressing risks in that value chain. And so if these claims, and I know that there's no reverse burden of proof yet, but if these claims are unfounded that your product would be made with forced labor, then it shouldn't, for a company, be all that difficult to go and show that it's got a sound due diligence policy, that it knows what goes on in its value chain. But in the reverse, if the claims are founded, well, then that is an indication that your due diligence probably wasn't performed correctly. And that's an indication that probably those supervisory authorities or others that look into due diligence being forced, that they have some homework to do, and that they need to go and see whether the due diligence policy of company X, Y, or Z was actually lip service.
that's an important, I think, touch point of the two. In order to make sure that this due diligence defense isn't a shield, I think we need to make sure that there's sound due diligence, there's quality due diligence, and how do we do that in the due diligence directive? I think by ensuring that there's liability as a deterrent, by making sure that there's proper stakeholder and trade union involvement, that trade unions and stakeholders get listened to and can serve as a sort of early warning system, and that there's proper supervision. There's a beauty also I find in, and I'll end soon, but in this piece, in that in due diligence we like to say our market, our rules, and I'm very, very convinced of that we need to say this is how we believe our internal market should be. These are our standards. The problem is that in terms of the enforcement of that, it won't be all that easy. What we have here, of course, is a very powerful stick, if the carrot has failed, that can serve us in due diligence. And maybe lastly, I touched on the entry points for NGOs and journalists already, I think, but that will be very important in due diligence, in the stakeholder consultation that needs to take place. That can serve also, I think, as an alert mechanism for then checking products. And lastly, remediation was talked about here. I think that we need to call the Commission and check why in every single proposal remediation is being left out, whether maybe there's a keyboard problem in the Commission or a software problem, but we remedied that in the due diligence proposal, and hopefully you would be able to do the same, but at least in due diligence we would have a safety net. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara. And I think although the timing of the proposals is not exactly the same, because the one is ahead of the other, internally for us as S&D, it's very good to keep very close contact between the ones who are leading the forced labor and the due diligence. Voilà. Very happy to announce you that we have a full 10 minutes for the audience. That means that I'll take really, really very sharp questions, and please also indicate to whom you address your question, and at maximum maybe 2. So not to all the 6, that's not possible. Okay, you hand first. Very sharp, to the point questions, please.
Fernando Morales de la Cruz from Cartoons for Change. As you all know, President von der Leyen committed to zero tolerance to child labor in EU trade. At the meeting in G7, ELMAO, they also co-signed a declaration committing to elimination of forced labor and child labor. But until today, none of the proposals of the Commission, nor the actions, unfortunately, act on the commitment to eliminate child labor in the supply chain of the EU. And the EU is the largest beneficiary of child labor in cocoa, coffee, and tens of other products. To any of you who want to take it, thank you. How can we do it?
Okay, I'll ask Antonio to answer, and Rafael. Is that okay? No, but it's a very important question. Child labor, or Helene, if that's more.
I think I'll take it.
Helene, yeah.
I won't answer on why the EU is not doing it. It's not my my portfolio, I must say. But on the difference between child labor and forced labor, and on the difference of why we also from Anti-Slavery International requested that child labor is not included into this proposal, is because we feel that this proposal, the forced labor regulation, is really like a very blunt instrument. And when you try to tackle child labor, I mean, we have to distinguish between what is classic child labor, and in some places, child labor is necessary for some families to actually gain a minimum income that is necessary for their living. And what we consider is like forced child labor, which is reprehensible and which should be covered. But addressing child labor is really looking at a system of root causes, at a systemic and society issues that are much wider and cannot be solved with a ban. So if you take, for example, the example of cocoa industry, they've been working in West Africa for years on trying to actually address the root causes of child labor, try to bring up education cases, try to develop further income. And I'm not a specialist on that field, so I'm sorry if I don't get all of it straight. But they are developing measures to try to increase the income for the family so that they don't have to send their children on the ground and work. So it's a much more long-term process that needs to be addressed in a much more wider and systemic manner than just by imposing a ban on a company. So that's why we're trying to differentiate child labor, forced labor, and forced labor on that front. why EU is not efficient enough, I will leave the decision makers to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I move to the next question because I think it was an excellent answer, please. Oh yeah, and then here and there. Okay, that's the three questions that I will take. René.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot also for this very, very interesting statements that you have put forward. Quick and clear questions, hopefully. First, to Antonio. When we are be it in due diligence or here, we always have an issue of proof. Now the burden of proof is on the market surveillance authorities. Do you think the way of how the issue of proof is dealt with in the draft is sufficient? Or do we need some additional measures, even going to a reversal of burden of proof? To Hélène, the question, I do believe trade unions are an important player in all this because they know the best what is happening on the ground, be it within the EU or outside of the EU. Do we need a right for trade unions to initiate investigations triggered by, made by the market surveillance authorities or the European Commission comparable to anti-dumping regulations as we have it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just take a few questions and then the answers. That's more efficient.
Thank you, Kathleen. Very short. I think the reversing of burden of proof is a possibility, but it's not easy to apply when we speak about regions, risk regions, and in first panel we spoke about regions, not companies, and also when we speak about forced labor sponsored by the state. It's difficult to use this mechanism as a solution. I would like to know about how to do it, and also about something that is in the impact study. There's an exception to SMEs. I'm against exception to small and medium business. I'm against, but I would like to word about this point.
Okay. I had another question. Yes, please.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's Elspeth here from Industrial Europe, so the European trade union that represents workers in mining, manufacturing and energy. So obviously for us, big concerns for textile workers and those in the mining industry and ICT. So thank you very much to the S&D group. I know it's something you've been pushing. Obviously, we welcome it, especially the scope, because as Lara will know, due diligence, the scope's far too big for textiles. It won't cover about 99% of textiles companies, so we see this as a great tool. However, for trade unions, this isn't a silver bullet. I really want to stress that it's a tool in the toolbox, but what we see is there's big issues in a lot of these countries in terms of freedom of association and collective bargaining, and that just doesn't exist at all. So we're really there to help whistleblowers to raise these concerns, but concretely, what can the S&D do in terms of looking at core ILO conventions, bearing in mind that in some of the FTA countries, we already have issues with freedom of association and collective bargaining. So not an easy question, but something to put to you. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go to Antonia, Hélène, and then the three politicians next to me. Antonio. We have like a minute per person.
Okay, very briefly, the scope. This is great, this proposal. The scope is universal. So big companies, small companies. That's very different from due diligence, and we are very happy about that. First point, reversal of burden of proof, or how do we get the proof? Yeah, there is a problem there. If you read the regulation at this point, you might ban one product from a factory that produces nails and hammers. The same factory, you have a procedure for the nails, forced labor, banned. But the hammers from the same factory can come in. It's absurd. So obviously we need to do something about that. And also we have heard about state-sponsored forced labor, Turkmenistan, China, and so on. Definitely, there is something to be done about being able to have a regional approach and not only a by-product approach. And finally, trade unions. Yes, definitely. Trade unions are the natural way to make sure that workers' rights are respected. And so definitely, trade unions need to be central in this. And we definitely want to see that.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Hélène, please.
Yes, very to support what Antonio just said. I mean, clearly trade unions are key players, but as the regulation is set up right now, everyone can put up a complaint, so including trade unions, which is something we value. Where we see that they should also have a stronger role is in monitoring the situation, monitoring potential remediation cases, and also acting as the in-between relation between the employers and the employees, because they have that role. In some countries, in particular when you have like freedom of association concern or collective agreement possibilities that are, I mean, the lack of possibility to actually discuss collective agreements, not all trade unions are reliable. You also have specific contexts where a trade union would focus, for example, in South Asia or in India. Trade unionists are mostly from the upper caste, and they would not defend the rights of lower caste workers. So we need to also combine those weaknesses and find a way to adapt to these vulnerable groups, and that's where other entities like human rights NGOs can also play a role, and representative of local communities. So all of these people are actually very well versed into defending the cases.
Okay, Raphael.
Yeah, thank you for the question on scope, because it allows us to set the difference between due diligence and the ban. It's a product-based instrument, so we don't care. SME, big company, it's universal, and it's good like that. It's product-based. Is the product made out of forced labor or not is the only question that should drive us. And for due diligence, we will have much more trouble to obtain this universal approach, because it's a company legislation. And this shows the difference, and it leads to different consequences. The difference are that in this company legislation, you can have a much more comprehensive approach in due diligence. And here it needs to stay sharp and product-based. And this is why I'm really very much insisting on that. And for it to be sharp, then the big question beyond delays and everything, it would be the burden of proof. And when you have a combination of risks, sector and geography, then we cannot have the proof as it stands in the documents we received. So it will be our discussion, fight, and we have to win. It's, again, to make this efficient, not an empty shell that then allows everything to happen, but we are happy to have a text. We don't care about having a text. We want something that will be enforceable and that will actually block these products. And we want to do that.
Thanks a lot. Crystal, please.
Just briefly, I do believe that we need to have the change in the burden of proof. I think that to a certain extent we can learn from the United States. We did that on Dieselgate. We can do it here as well. So this is definitely something. We need to make sure that this tool will be efficient, effectful. Otherwise, it will not have the needed effect. And therefore, I would like to say just one thing. I know that there is discussion about forced labor versus child labor. What I fear, honestly, is that if we ban products manufactured with forced labor, there is a risk that these products then might go over and be manufactured by children instead, because they will not be defined as forced labor. We need to make sure that this is not, that this will not be a loophole. I don't know how we do it. I think it's an Inter question more than an IMCO question, but as a socialist, I do think that we need to look into this, and I fear that. So we need to address this as well. Thanks.
Absolutely, take that on board. Lara, please.
Just on that question on trade unions, you will know that in the due diligence legislation, there's a long list of international conventions to be respected. So that's one way of helping with things like freedom of association and collective bargaining. I've tried to improve measures on consultation of workers, grievance mechanisms also. And I think lastly, what would help a great deal is if we all, instead of talking about an enshrining minimum wage, but we talked about living wages, and that way, hopefully, with collective bargaining, we can also do our bit of help.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you for a warm applause for my excellent panelists? And then I just have one more task, to ask them to leave.
Yeah.
And and to ask my wonderful colleague Ima Rodriguez Pinheiro, all these two names again, to come here to make the final remarks. As you know, political life, a lot of politicians, some politicians think that they achieved something. Can I tell you a secret? You do not achieve anything in political life unless you make a team. As I said, Lara, Crystal, Raphael, within the S&D, together with NGOs, together with unions, I think we made this thing happen. We're not yet there, but we have a proposal. Well, Ima is a very important part of that team because she's the coordinator in the INTA committee. And in that sense, one of the driving forces to force also the Commission to come up with a proposal. So, Ima, I'm so happy and honored to give you the floor to make the final remarks, please.
Muchísimas gracias, Kathleen, y muchísimas gracias a todos los que habéis participado, habéis estado con nosotros en este evento, y muchísimas gracias a todos los expertos, panelistas y colegas que han participado, ¿no? Para mí, sin duda alguna, es un placer poder estar aquí con vosotros, haber participado y poder hacer las conclusiones finales, ¿no? Yo creo que quedó claro al principio y ha sido reconocido tanto en el primer panel como en este segundo el liderazgo indiscutible de nuestro grupo político para hacer posible que hoy tengamos este evento aquí. Porque hace 2 años era impensable que tuviéramos encima de la mesa una propuesta de la Comisión para combatir el trabajo forzoso, prohibiendo la entrada de productos fabricados con esta lacra en la Unión Europea. Y creo que es muy importante la palabra liderazgo. Yo creo que una de las conclusiones que estamos todos de acuerdo es no queremos una ley bonita, queremos una ley que prohíba de verdad y que acabe de verdad con la peor lacra del siglo XXI, la esclavitud. Porque el trabajo forzoso es la forma moderna de la esclavitud. Algo que nunca debía haber tenido lugar y se debería de haber acabado desde el día siguiente al que empezó. Pero se ha consentido porque no ha habido liderazgo político para acabar con ello. Tenemos que encontrar la mejor forma de ser eficaces, de que la ley se aplique, de evitar la elusión. Yo creo que eso es un tema fundamental. Impedir que nuestra ley dé lugar a que haya otros agujeros por donde puedan seguir vendiendo los productos del horror. Y eso requiere que efectivamente la legislación de la diligencia debida y la legislación de la prohibición del trabajo forzoso trabajen de manera absolutamente complementaria para impedir que esto siga ocurriendo. Yo de todo, lo primero destacar, la normativa que se ha presentado yo creo que es un buen punto de partida. Como todas las veces que se presenta una normativa en este Parlamento, todas son susceptibles de mejora y todas las mejoramos. Aquí va a ser un trabajo largo y complicado, porque los sectores que defienden por encima de todo los intereses económicos, empresariales y los beneficios van a mirar por encima de todo la carga burocrática que suponga para las empresas. Nosotros lo que lógicamente vamos a trabajar es para impedir que puedan haber intereses económicos que estén por encima de los intereses de las vidas humanas y de los derechos humanos. Y ahí va a estar el debate, pero tenemos liderazgo, tenemos argumentos, tenemos sobre todo la razón. Y ahora necesitamos la alianza de todos, los actores que estáis sobre el terreno y que conocéis la realidad, que nos tenéis que ayudar a conocerla mejor para que regulemos pensando en cómo se aplica, para que nunca pueda haber una elusión. Eso es fundamental. Y necesitamos la alianza con los demás grupos políticos. Tendremos que convencer a la mayoría suficiente para que consigamos que esta ley se apruebe en este Parlamento, en esta legislatura. No nos podemos, aquí también hemos de ser concretos en los plazos, no nos podemos permitir que quede pendiente para la legislatura siguiente. Y además ha de ser una bandera de todos los progresistas. Desde luego de nuestro grupo, sin duda alguna, lo es y lo va a ser. Porque vamos a seguir trabajando, dejándonos la piel para que sea una realidad. Lo hicimos con los minerales de la sangre. Lo hicimos con el algodón en Uzbekistán, que hasta que no conseguimos que se prohibiera la importación del algodón de Uzbekistán, no paramos. Y vamos a hacer exactamente lo mismo con la prohibición del trabajo forzoso y con la diligencia debida. Así que os pido que ese liderazgo, que esa colaboración, que esa alianza, hoy es el primer paso. Vamos a seguir hasta el final y, desde luego, no me cabe duda de que lo vamos a conseguir. Así que muchísimas gracias y a por ello.
This concludes, I think, this very interesting workshop. And can I also ask an applause for yourself, for being here, for being active? Thank you very much. You're wonderful.